They called her Granny behind her back, snickering as they dumped entire trays of food just to watch her clean it up. What these high school bullies didn't know was that Maria Santos had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Purple Heart, and could take down a grown man twice her size without breaking a sweat. They were about to learn that messing with the wrong lunch lady could be the biggest mistake of their lives. Maria Santos stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, her graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had seen better days. At 53, her weathered hands told stories of hard work and sacrifice, calloused from years of service, both military and civilian. She wore the standard-issue burgundy uniform of Jefferson High School's cafeteria staff, the polyester fabric, faded from countless washings. Her sensible white sneakers squeaked softly against the linoleum as she moved efficiently between serving stations, ladling portions with mechanical precision. The morning shift at Jefferson High began at 5:30 a.m., 2 hours before the first student would set foot on campus. Maria arrived 15 minutes early every day, a habit ingrained from 22 years of military service, where punctuality wasn't just expected but demanded. She unlocked the cafeteria doors with keys that jingled against her belt loop, the sound echoing through the empty corridors like a reveille call only she could hear. Jefferson High School sprawled across 40 acres in the suburbs of Millbrook, Tennessee, a growing town that had transformed from rural farmland to cookie-cutter subdivisions seemingly overnight. The school itself was a monument to beige brick and functional architecture, built in the early 2000s when the district received federal funding for expansion. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the main hallway, designed to create an open, welcoming atmosphere that fooled exactly no one who actually attended classes there. The student body of 3,000 represented a cross-section of modern suburban America, from the children of tech executives who'd relocated from California to the descendants of families who'd worked these lands for generations. Most fell somewhere in between, products of middle management and service industry careers, raised on participation trophies and social media validation. They moved through the halls in carefully orchestrated social hierarchies, each group defending its territory with the fierce dedication of ancient tribal warriors. Maria had taken the job 8 months ago, not out of financial necessity, but from a desperate need for purpose. After retiring from the Army as a master sergeant, she'd spent 2 years rattling around her small apartment like a marble in a shoebox. The silence had been deafening after decades of mess halls filled with the chatter of soldiers, the constant background hum of military life that had become her soundtrack. Civilian life felt hollow, empty of the structure and meaning that had defined her existence since she'd enlisted at 18. The application process had been straightforward enough. Jefferson High needed cafeteria staff, and Maria needed something to fill the endless hours between dawn and dusk. The job paid barely above minimum wage, but money had never been her primary motivator. She'd served religiously during her military career, lived in base housing, eaten at the mess hall, and sent most of her paycheck home to her younger sister who was raising 3 kids alone. Her needs were simple, her wants even simpler. During the interview with Mrs. Patterson, the cafeteria supervisor, Maria had kept her military background vague. She mentioned her service in passing, focusing instead on her food service experience from various base assignments. Mrs. Patterson, a harried woman in her 60s who'd been running school cafeterias longer than some of her employees had been alive, had been more interested in Maria's availability and reliability than her war stories. The early weeks had been an adjustment period that tested even Maria's considerable reserves of patience. The industrial kitchen equipment was different from military mess halls, more automated, but somehow less efficient. The students presented challenges she'd never encountered in her military career. Soldiers, even the youngest recruits, understood respect and discipline. These teenagers seemed to view the cafeteria staff as part of the furniture, barely human enough to warrant basic courtesy. Maria's co-workers were a mixed group of women, ranging from their early 20s to late 60s. Most of them working part-time to supplement household incomes or escape empty homes. They'd welcomed her with the cautious friendliness common to service industry veterans, people who'd learned to band together against the daily indignities of their position. She'd kept her distance initially, polite but professional, old habits of military hierarchy making casual friendship feel somehow inappropriate. The work itself was physically demanding but mentally numbing. She arrived before dawn to help prepare breakfast service, moved through lunch preparation with assembly line efficiency, then spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing for the next day. Her station was the vegetable and side dish line, where she spooned portions of corn, green beans, mashed potatoes, and whatever other accompaniments the district's nutritionist had deemed acceptable for growing minds. The cafeteria during meal periods resembled a controlled riot more than a dining experience. 800 students had exactly 30 minutes to navigate the serving line, find seats, consume their meals, and clear their areas before the next wave descended. The noise level rivaled that of a helicopter landing zone. Conversations shouted over the din of scraping chairs, clattering trays, and the constant background hum of teenage drama. Most students moved through the line with mechanical efficiency, eyes on their phones, earbuds blocking out the world around them. They mumbled responses to her cheerful greetings, grabbed their portions without acknowledgement, and disappeared into the chaos of the dining area. Maria had learned not to take it personally. Teenagers had always been self-absorbed creatures, and modern technology had simply amplified their natural tendencies toward social isolation. But some students were different. Some students had apparently decided that the cafeteria staff existed solely for their entertainment, target practice, for their developing cruelty. They'd learned that adults in service positions couldn't fight back, couldn't defend themselves without risking their jobs, their livelihoods, their ability to keep roofs over their heads and food on their tables. The ringleader of this particular group was Tyler Brennan, a 17-year-old junior whose father owned 3 car dealerships and whose mother spent her days managing their family's various charitable foundations. Tyler had inherited his father's commanding presence and his mother's ability to weaponize social expectations. At 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders of someone who'd grown up with personal trainers and nutritionists, he moved through the school hallways like a young emperor surveying his domain. Tyler's cruelty wasn't the random violence of an angry teenager acting out against authority. It was calculated, strategic, designed to extract maximum entertainment value while maintaining plausible deniability. He'd perfected the art of tormenting service workers in ways that looked like accidents to casual observers, misunderstandings that could be explained away with innocent shrugs and confused expressions. His inner circle consisted of Madison Wells, whose pharmaceutical executive parents had bought her way into every honor society and leadership position the school offered, and Jake Morrison, a varsity football player whose athletic scholarship hopes depended on maintaining his image as a clean-cut all-American kid. Together, they formed a trio of privilege and entitlement that had learned to wield their advantages like weapons against anyone they deemed beneath their notice. The harassment had started small, almost imperceptibly, like the first drops of rain before a thunderstorm. Tyler would approach Maria's station with his trademark smile, the one that had charmed teachers and parents for years, and make comments that walked the knife's edge between friendly conversation and subtle mockery. He'd compliment her uniform while his eyes conveyed the opposite message. He'd thank her for her service in a tone that suggested he was doing her the favor. Madison preferred psychological warfare, asking pointed questions about Maria's living situation, her family, her future plans, each inquiry designed to highlight the gap between Maria's circumstances and her own privileged existence. She'd express concern about whether Maria was eating enough, whether she could afford decent health care, whether she ever felt sad about how her life had turned out. Jake's contributions were more physical, though carefully choreographed to appear accidental. He'd bump into Maria while she was carrying trays, apologize profusely while she cleaned up the mess, then repeat the performance the next day. He'd reach across her serving area in ways that forced her to step back, duck down, accommodate his presence in her workspace. The other cafeteria workers had noticed the pattern, but said nothing. They'd all experienced similar treatment over the years and learned to endure it as part of the job description. Students came and went, graduated and moved on, but the cafeteria staff remained, and making waves could lead to administrative scrutiny that none of them could afford. Maria had initially dismissed the behavior as typical teenage testing, the kind of boundary pushing that was natural for kids that age. She'd dealt with far worse during her military career, survived actual combat situations where lives hung in the balance. High school bullies seemed laughably insignificant by comparison, but as the weeks passed and the harassment escalated, Maria began to recognize something familiar in their behavior. It wasn't random teenage cruelty. It was the systematic dehumanization she'd witnessed in war zones, the way occupying forces treated local populations they decided were less than human. These kids had identified her as someone they could abuse without consequences, and they were methodically testing the boundaries of how far they could push before someone pushed back. The realization both saddened and angered her in ways she hadn't expected. She'd fought overseas to protect the freedoms these children took for granted, defended their right to attend school without fear, to grow up in a country where opportunity was supposed to be available to everyone willing to work for it. Now, she was watching them use those same freedoms to torture a woman whose only crime was serving their lunch with a smile. The transformation from subtle mockery to open cruelty happened gradually, like watching storm clouds gather on a distant horizon. Tyler Brennan had spent weeks testing Maria's boundaries, probing for weaknesses with the patience of a predator studying its prey. He'd discovered that she never complained, never reported incidents, never even raised her voice when his accidents became increasingly frequent and obviously deliberate. Mrs. Patterson ruled the Jefferson High cafeteria with the iron fist of someone who'd survived 37 years in the school system. At 62, she'd outlasted 6 principals, countless policy changes, and more budget cuts than she cared to remember. Her office was a cramped space behind the main kitchen, wallpapered with nutrition charts, supplier catalogs, and photographs of her grandchildren. She wore her authority like armor, deflecting complaints from parents, students, and administrators with equal efficiency. The problem was that Mrs. Patterson had learned to pick her battles carefully. Fighting for her staff against student complaints required political capital she preferred to reserve for more serious issues like budget allocations and equipment repairs. When Tyler Brennan's mother called to express concern about her son's treatment by surly cafeteria workers, Mrs. Patterson chose the path of least resistance. During their brief meeting in her cluttered office, Mrs. Patterson delivered what she clearly considered sage advice. "These kids come from important families, Maria. Their parents donate to the school, serve on committees, write recommendation letters for college admissions. Sometimes we have to swallow our pride to keep the peace. It's not personal, it's just politics." Maria had nodded politely, kept her expression neutral, and filed the conversation away as intelligence about the true nature of her battlefield. Mrs. Patterson wasn't malicious, just pragmatic in the way that career bureaucrats learned to be. She'd survive another budget cycle by avoiding controversy, and if that meant sacrificing the dignity of her lowest-paid employees, well, that was simply the cost of doing business. The math department faculty lounge was located directly adjacent to the cafeteria, separated by a thin wall that did little to muffle conversations. Mr. Richard Howell, who'd been teaching algebra for 15 years, often ate his lunch while grading papers at the small table near the window. He'd noticed the escalating harassment of the lunch lady, but hadn't felt compelled to intervene. Teachers had their own battles to fight, their own job security to protect during one particularly uncomfortable incident, where Tyler had accidentally knocked an entire tray of food from Maria's hands. Mr. Howell had actually looked up from his papers. He'd watched through the service window as she cleaned up the mess while Tyler offered exaggerated apologies, his friends snickering behind him. For a moment, Mr. Howell had considered stepping outside, saying something, asserting adult authority. Instead, he'd returned to his grading, telling himself it wasn't his responsibility to police student behavior outside his classroom. The assistant principal, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, prided herself on maintaining discipline through positive reinforcement rather than punitive measures. She'd implemented a peer mediation program, established restorative justice circles, and created safe spaces for students to express their concerns. Her office was decorated with motivational posters and stress balls shaped like various cartoon characters. She genuinely believed in her progressive approach to education, but Dr. Walsh also understood the delicate ecosystem of a suburban high school. Tyler Brennan's father served on the school board, Madison Wells' mother chaired the PTA fundraising committee, and Jake Morrison was being recruited by 3 different state universities. These weren't the students who required her intervention. They were the success stories, the ones who made the school statistics look good in district reports. When she'd witnessed Tyler deliberately blocking Maria's path while carrying a large pot of soup, forcing the older woman to awkwardly maneuver around him, Dr. Walsh had made a mental note to address it later. Later became tomorrow, tomorrow became next week, and next week became a vague intention to speak with him about respect and empathy when the opportunity naturally arose. The harassment escalated in both frequency and creativity. Tyler discovered that Maria never complained about extra work, so he began making elaborate messes that required extensive cleanup. He'd deliberately knock over salt shakers, spill drinks on tables she just cleaned, and drop food in places that forced her to get on her hands and knees to retrieve it. His friends found this endlessly entertaining, often filming the incidents on their phones for later amusement. Madison had developed a particularly cruel habit of questioning Maria's competence in front of other students. She'd examine her food with exaggerated suspicion, ask if the vegetables were safe to eat, and wonder aloud whether someone so old should be handling food preparation. Her comments were always delivered with a concerned smile that made them difficult to challenge directly. Jake's contribution was more physical intimidation. He'd stand too close while she was working, forcing her to navigate around his imposing frame. He'd reach over her head for napkins or condiments, his bulk creating a cage that trapped her against the serving counter. He'd lean heavily on surfaces she was trying to clean, making her work around his presence like an obstacle course. The other students had initially ignored the harassment, too focused on their own social dramas to notice the systematic humiliation of a cafeteria worker. But as Tyler's group became more bold and theatrical in their cruelty, it became impossible to miss. Some looked uncomfortable, averting their eyes when the abuse became particularly obvious. Others found it mildly entertaining, a brief distraction from the monotony of institutional food service. None intervened. The social cost of defending a lunch lady against popular students was simply too high for teenagers already navigating the treacherous waters of high school hierarchy. They'd learned to protect themselves by staying invisible, by not drawing attention that might redirect the bullies' focus in their direction. Maria's co-workers watched the escalating situation with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the primary targets. Sandra Williams, who'd worked the breakfast line for 12 years, occasionally offered Maria encouragement during their brief breaks. "Kids these days don't have any respect," she'd say, shaking her head sadly. "My generation would never have gotten away with treating adults like that." But Sandra's support was limited to private commiseration. When Tyler's group was present, she kept her head down and focused on her own responsibilities. Self-preservation was a luxury that minimum-wage workers couldn't afford to ignore. The breaking point was building like pressure in a sealed container, invisible to outside observers, but increasingly dangerous for everyone in its vicinity. Maria continued to arrive early, work efficiently, and maintain her professional demeanor, but something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface. The discipline that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments was being tested by adversaries who had no idea what they were unleashing. The Tuesday morning, when everything changed, started like any other. Maria arrived at 5:15, unlocked the cafeteria doors, and began her routine of firing up the industrial ovens and checking inventory. The delivery truck from Cisco Foods had arrived early, and she spent the first hour helping unload cases of canned vegetables, frozen proteins, and institutional-sized containers of condiments. Her movements were economical and practiced muscle memory from decades of logistics work in environments where efficiency meant survival. The breakfast service passed without incident. The early crowd consisted mainly of athletes grabbing quick meals before morning practice and students whose parents dropped them off on their way to work. These kids were generally more subdued, focused on waking up rather than entertaining themselves at someone else's expense. Maria served portions of scrambled eggs, hash browns, and fruit cups with minimal interaction, the way both sides preferred it. The problems always began during lunch service, when the school's social hierarchies were most visibly on display. The cafeteria transformed from a quiet institutional space into a battlefield of teenage politics, where seating arrangements carried more weight than international treaties and fashion choices could determine someone's worth for the entire semester. Into this charged atmosphere, Tyler's group descended like vultures circling fresh carrion. The first incident occurred during the second lunch period, when Tyler approached Maria's station, carrying an empty tray despite having already eaten during the first lunch. This violation of cafeteria protocol should have been caught by the student monitors, but they'd learned to look the other way when popular students bent the rules. Tyler stood in line behind genuine students, his presence creating an uncomfortable tension that rippled through the serving area. When he reached Maria's station, Tyler made a show of examining the available vegetables with theatrical disappointment. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the false politeness that had become his trademark, "but this corn looks pretty gross. Are you sure it's safe to eat? I mean, with your eyesight and all, it might be hard to tell if something's gone bad." The comment was delivered loud enough for students in both directions to hear, and several turned to watch the interaction. Maria maintained her professional smile and began serving a portion of corn onto his plate, but Tyler pulled the tray away at the last second. The corn scattered across the counter and floor, bright yellow kernels rolling in every direction like tiny marbles. "Oh no!" Tyler exclaimed with exaggerated concern. "I'm so sorry about that. You must be having a rough day. Maybe you should consider whether this job is too much for someone your age." His friends Madison and Jake had materialized behind him, their phones already recording what they anticipated would be another amusing episode for their social media feeds. Maria knelt to clean up the scattered corn, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the heat building in her chest. She'd learned long ago that displays of anger only encouraged bullies and gave them the reaction they craved. But as she swept corn kernels into a dustpan while students stepped around her like she was part of the furniture, something cold and familiar settled in her stomach. The second incident happened barely an hour later, during the final lunch period of the day. Jake Morrison approached the serving line with his usual swagger, his varsity letterman jacket hanging open to display the various patches and medals that proclaimed his athletic achievements. He'd brought 2 teammates with him, underclassmen, eager to curry favor with the star defensive end who could make or break their chances of significant playing time. When Jake reached Maria's station, he leaned heavily against the serving counter and began an elaborate conversation with his friends that completely ignored her presence. They discussed weekend parties, college recruiters, and which girls they planned to ask to homecoming, their voices loud and deliberately crude. Maria waited patiently, serving spoon in hand, while they treated her workspace like their personal social club. Finally, Jake turned his attention to the food options with the bored expression of someone forced to choose between equally unappetizing alternatives. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked, pointing at the green bean casserole with obvious disgust. "It looks like something my dog threw up." Maria began to serve a portion despite the insult, but Jake held up his hand to stop her. "Actually, you know what? I don't think I trust anything you've touched. You probably don't even wash your hands properly. Do they make people your age take food safety courses? Or do they just assume you'll figure it out?" The teammates laughed on cue, and Jake's performance grew bolder. He began pointing out alleged hygiene violations, questioning whether Maria's hairnet was properly secured, wondering aloud if her old hands were steady enough to avoid contaminating the food. Each comment was designed to humiliate while maintaining the pretense of legitimate concern about food safety. Madison Wells joined the group during Jake's performance, her arrival perfectly timed to coincide with his crescendo of creative cruelty. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for her actions, her designer handbag and carefully styled appearance marking her as untouchable in the school's social ecosystem. "Oh my God, Jake, you're so right to be concerned," Madison said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I've been wondering about that too. Like, doesn't the health department have age limits for food service workers? I mean, no offense," she added, finally acknowledging Maria's presence with a patronizing smile. "But shouldn't there be some kind of competency testing? For everyone's safety." The three students continued their performance for several minutes, taking turns adding new layers to their collective humiliation of Maria, while other students watched with varying degrees of discomfort and amusement. Some looked genuinely distressed by what they were witnessing, but none possessed the social capital or courage necessary to intervene against such popular students. Maria served their portions with mechanical precision, her face a mask of professional neutrality that revealed nothing of the storm building behind her eyes. She'd survived mortar attacks in Kandahar, endured roadside bombs in Baghdad, and watched friends die in places whose names these children couldn't pronounce. But somehow, standing in a suburban high school cafeteria while teenagers questioned her basic human dignity felt like a different kind of warfare entirely. The breaking point was still ahead, building like a pressure wave that would soon shatter. The carefully maintained fiction that allowed such cruelty to flourish unchallenged. What Tyler Brennan, Madison Wells, and Jake Morrison didn't know was that Maria Santos had enlisted in the United States Army on her 18th birthday, 3 days after graduating from Roosevelt High School in East Los Angeles. While her classmates were planning college orientations and summer jobs, Maria was reporting to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training that would transform her from a quiet teenager into a disciplined soldier. The decision to join the military hadn't been driven by patriotic fervor or family tradition. Maria's father had abandoned the family when she was 12, leaving her mother Elena to raise 3 children on a housekeeper's salary. The Army offered structure, purpose, and most importantly, financial stability that could help support her younger sister Rosa and brother Carlos while giving Maria a path forward that didn't require college tuition her family couldn't afford. Basic training had been a revelation. The physical challenges that broke other recruits felt manageable to Maria, who'd spent her teenage years working construction jobs alongside her uncle during summers and weekends. The mental discipline required to succeed came naturally to someone who'd learned early that survival depended on keeping emotions in check and focusing on practical solutions rather than emotional reactions. Her drill sergeants recognized something special in the quiet young woman who never complained, never made excuses, and seemed to possess an internal compass that always pointed toward excellence. Staff Sergeant Williams, A 20-year veteran who'd seen thousands of recruits pass through his program pulled Maria aside during the final week of training. "Santos," he'd said, using the gruff tone that masked genuine respect, "you've got what it takes to go far in this army. Don't waste it on some dead-end military occupational specialty. Think about intelligence. Think about leadership. Think about making a career that matters." Maria had followed his advice, scoring high enough on the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery to qualify for military intelligence training. Fort Huachuca, Arizona, became her next stop, where she learned to analyze satellite imagery, interpret intercepted communications, and understand the complex patterns that revealed enemy movements and intentions. The transition from recruit to intelligence analyst had required developing new skills, while maintaining the physical readiness that was expected of every soldier. Maria excelled at both, earning commendations for her analytical work while consistently scoring perfect marks on physical fitness tests. Her superiors noted her unusual combination of intellectual curiosity and tactical awareness, traits that would serve her well in the deployments ahead. Her first combat deployment came in 2003, during the initial invasion of Iraq. As part of the 1st Infantry Division, Maria found herself in convoy security, missions that required split-second decision-making, and the ability to distinguish between genuine threats and civilian populations caught in the crossfire. The work was dangerous, demanding, and absolutely crucial to the success of larger military operations. The roadside bomb that earned her the Purple Heart had detonated during what should have been a routine intelligence gathering mission outside Fallujah. Maria's Humvee had been third in a convoy of 5 vehicles when an improvised explosive device hidden in a concrete barrier erupted with enough force to flip their vehicle completely over. The blast killed Private Johnson, who'd been riding in the passenger seat, and left Maria with shrapnel wounds in her left shoulder and a concussion that took weeks to fully resolve. But it was the aftermath of that attack that truly defined Maria's military character. Despite her injuries, she crawled from the overturned vehicle and immediately began coordinating defensive positions while waiting for the medical evacuation helicopter. Her quick thinking and leadership under fire had prevented the insurgents from overrunning their position and potentially capturing sensitive intelligence materials. The commendation letter from her commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, described Maria's actions as exemplary courage under fire and leadership that epitomizes the finest traditions of the United States Army. But for Maria, it had simply been doing what needed to be done, the kind of automatic response that separated professional soldiers from weekend warriors. Her second deployment, to Afghanistan in 2007, involved more specialized work with special operations units conducting counterintelligence operations in the mountainous regions near the Pakistani border. Maria's language skills, she'd taught herself conversational Pashto during her downtime, made her invaluable for interrogating captured insurgents and gathering intelligence from local populations. The work required psychological sophistication that went far beyond her original military training. Understanding the complex tribal politics of rural Afghanistan, recognizing when someone was lying under extreme stress, and building rapport with people who had every reason to distrust American soldiers demanded skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Maria discovered she had a natural talent for reading people, for recognizing the subtle tells that revealed deception or fear or genuine cooperation. Her reports consistently provided actionable intelligence that saved American lives and disrupted enemy operations. By the end of her deployment, she'd been promoted to staff sergeant and recommended for advanced leadership training. Her third and final combat deployment took her back to Iraq in 2010, where she served as an intelligence liaison with Iraqi security forces during the drawdown of American combat operations. This assignment required even more diplomatic skill, as she worked to transfer knowledge and capabilities to Iraqi personnel while maintaining the security protocols necessary to protect ongoing American interests. the work was frustrating in ways that combat had never been. Iraqi officers often resented American oversight, while simultaneously depending on American resources and expertise. Building trust across cultural and language barriers while navigating the complex politics of a society emerging from decades of dictatorship and years of war required patience and wisdom that tested every leadership skill Maria had developed. She'd succeeded, earning another commendation and the respect of both American and Iraqi personnel. Her final efficiency report described her as an outstanding non-commissioned officer with unlimited potential for continued service and advancement. The recommendation for officer candidate school had been enthusiastic and unanimous among her chain of command. Maria had seriously considered the opportunity to become a commissioned officer, to continue building a military career that had already exceeded her teenage expectations. But 22 years of service had taken their toll in ways that weren't visible on her medical records or reflected in her personnel file. She was tired, not physically but emotionally, drained by the constant vigilance required to survive. In combat zones where any mistake could mean death for herself or her subordinates, the decision to retire had been difficult but necessary. Maria wanted to discover who she was outside the structure and purpose that had defined her adult life, to explore civilian possibilities while she was still young enough to build a second career. The transition had proved more challenging than any military assignment she'd ever faced. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday afternoon during the chaos of third lunch period, when the cafeteria reached peak capacity and teenage tensions ran highest. Maria had been working methodically through her serving responsibilities, spooning portions of mashed potatoes and green beans while maintaining the professional demeanor that had become her armor against daily humiliations. The lunch crowd was particularly rowdy that day, energized by rumors of an upcoming pep rally and the promise of an early dismissal for homecoming preparations. Tyler Brennan approached her station with an unusual swagger, his confidence amplified by the presence of a larger audience than usual. Word had spread through the school's social networks about his ongoing harassment of the lunch lady, and students had begun timing their lunch periods to witness what had become a form of cruel entertainment. Several had their phones ready, anticipating another viral moment at Maria's expense. Behind Tyler walked Madison Wells, wearing a homecoming court sash that proclaimed her recent election as junior class princess. The victory had inflated her already considerable ego, and she carried herself with the imperious bearing of someone who believed her popularity granted her unlimited license to treat others however she pleased. Jake Morrison flanked her other side, his letterman jacket freshly cleaned and his confidence boosted by college recruitment letters that had arrived that morning. But this time, they'd brought reinforcements. Kevin Walsh, the student body treasurer and son of the assistant principal, had joined their group along with Ashley Chen, whose father owned the largest construction company in town. Together, they formed a formidable coalition of privilege and entitlement, teenagers who'd learned that their family connections could insulate them from consequences that applied to lesser mortals. Tyler placed his tray on the counter with theatrical precision and began his performance with renewed energy. Well, 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 he announced loudly enough to ensure maximum audience participation. If it isn't our favorite cafeteria worker. Tell me, Granny, how are those shaky old hands holding up today? Still managing to keep the food off the floor? The nickname Granny had evolved over weeks of harassment, a deliberately infantilizing term designed to strip Maria of dignity while reducing her to a caricature of elderly incompetence. The other students had begun using it as well, turning her given name into something forgotten and her identity into a punchline. Madison stepped forward with her practiced smile, the one she'd perfected for beauty pageants and student government campaigns. You know, I've been thinking about your situation, she said with false concern, and I really think we should be worried about workplace safety. I mean, someone your age probably has vision problems, maybe arthritis, definitely slower. Reflexes. What if you hurt yourself? Or worse, what if you hurt us? The comment drew laughter from their assembled audience. Teenagers who'd gathered in a loose semicircle around the serving station, like spectators at a gladiator match. Their phones captured every moment, recording what they believed was harmless. Fun rather than systematic psychological warfare designed to break down another human being's sense of worth and dignity. Jake Morrison contributed his own observation with the casual cruelty that had become his signature. "I was telling my mom about you last night," he lied smoothly, "and she said that most people your age are probably retired by now, living in nursing homes or whatever. She wondered why someone would still be working such a hard job when they should probably be, taking it easy." Ashley Chun, eager to prove herself worthy of inclusion in this popular group, added her own twist to the harassment. "My dad hires a lot of people for construction work," she said, "and he has to be really careful about age discrimination laws. But he says there's a reason most jobs have unofficial age limits: safety, competence, basic standards." Kevin Walsh, emboldened by his family connection to the school's administration, took the harassment in a more official direction. "Actually, I've been wondering about the hiring policies here at Jefferson. Like, what kind of background checks do they do? What kind of training? Requirements? Because honestly, some of the food handling I've seen makes me question whether proper procedures are being followed." The group continued their performance for several minutes, each member contributing new layers of humiliation, while Maria maintained her professional composure with increasing difficulty. They questioned her hygiene, her competence, her right to occupy space in their privileged world. They treated her like an object rather than a person, a prop in their ongoing performance of superiority. The final straw came when Tyler deliberately knocked his tray to the floor, sending food scattering across the serving area and creating a mess that would require extensive cleanup. But instead of offering his usual sarcastic apology, he crossed a line that even his previous cruelty hadn't approached. "You know what, Granny?" he said, his voice dropping to a tone that carried genuine malice rather than performed mockery. "I think it's time someone told you the truth. Nobody wants you here. The students think you're gross. The other workers talk about how slow you are. And I bet even your own family is embarrassed that this is what your life has become." He paused for effect, savoring the attention of his audience and the apparent powerlessness of his target. "My dad sits on the school board, and he's been hearing complaints about the cafeteria staff. Apparently, there's been discussion about downsizing, getting rid of dead weight. I wonder who they'll choose to fire first." Madison seized the opportunity to add her own finishing touch to Tyler's psychological assault. "It's actually kind of sad," she said with mock sympathy, "when people don't realize it's time to step aside and let younger, more capable people take over. I mean, what's the point of hanging on when everyone can see you're past your prime?" The assembled students laughed and applauded the performance, their social media feeds already lighting up with videos and commentary about the latest humiliation of the school's most vulnerable employee. They saw entertainment where others might have seen cruelty, comedy where observers with different perspectives might have recognized systematic abuse. But what none of them noticed was the subtle change in Maria's posture, the way her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly and her breathing shifted to the controlled rhythm she'd learned during countless high-stress situations in combat zones. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly with suppressed emotion, steadied into the rock-solid stability that had once guided precision rifle shots across hostile terrain. The crowd around the serving station had grown to include nearly 50 students, drawn by the spectacle and the promise of social media content that would generate likes and shares across their various platforms. They formed a loose amphitheater around Maria's station, their phones creating a forest of recording devices that captured every angle of what they expected to be her complete humiliation. Tyler stepped closer to the serving counter, invading Maria's workspace with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Come on, Granny," he said, his voice taking on a taunting quality that pushed beyond mockery into outright cruelty. "Say something. Defend yourself. Or are you too old and tired to even fight back anymore?" The silence that followed was profound, charged with the kind of tension that precedes explosive violence or complete surrender. The watching students leaned forward unconsciously, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would define the remainder of the school year and possibly their own understanding of power dynamics. Maria looked up from the scattered food on the floor, her eyes meeting Tyler's with a steadiness that should have warned him he was standing at the edge of a precipice he didn't even know existed. Maria Santos straightened slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled in a way that would have been familiar to anyone who'd served under her command in Afghanistan. The transformation was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to the crowd of teenagers who expected either tears or surrender from their victim. But something fundamental had shifted in her posture, in the set of her jaw, in the way she held her shoulders back with military precision. "You want to know about my background?" Maria said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade through silk. The casual friendliness that had characterized her interactions with students was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "Let me tell you about my background." Tyler's confident smirk faltered slightly as Maria stepped around the serving counter, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone trained in close-quarters combat. She wasn't threatening him physically, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she could if she chose to. The other students sensed the shift as well, their excited chatter dying down as they recognized that the dynamics of the situation had changed in ways they didn't understand. "My name is Master Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Army, retired," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "For 22 years, I served my country in 3 combat deployments across Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been shot at, bombed, and nearly killed more times than you've probably been to the dentist." Madison Wells took an unconscious step backward, her pageant-trained smile wavering as she processed information that didn't fit her assumptions about the woman she'd been tormenting. The other students exchanged confused glances, their phones still recording but their entertainment value rapidly diminishing as they realized they might have seriously miscalculated their target. Maria reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out her military identification card, holding it up for the assembled crowd to see. "Purple Heart recipient for wounds sustained in combat near Fallujah, Iraq. Bronze Star for meritorious service during Operation Enduring Freedom. Army Commendation. Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters for excellence in military intelligence operations." She began walking slowly around the group of students, not menacingly, but with the measured pace of an instructor delivering a lesson they'd never forget. "I've interrogated terrorists, tracked insurgent movements through satellite imagery, and coordinated operations that saved American lives and disrupted enemy plans across 2 war zones." Jake Morrison, who'd built his identity around physical intimidation and athletic prowess, found himself looking up at a woman he outweighed by 60 pounds but who somehow made him feel small and insignificant. His letterman jacket, which had always symbolized his dominance in the school's social hierarchy, suddenly felt like a child's costume in the presence of someone who'd worn a real uniform in real combat. "I speak 3 languages fluently," Maria continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone accustomed to briefing military personnel on life-and-death situations. "I can field strip and reassemble 17 different weapon systems blindfolded. I've survived mortar attacks, roadside bombs, and enemy sniper fire while maintaining operational effectiveness and protecting the soldiers under my command." Crowd of students had swelled to nearly 100, drawn by whispered reports that something extraordinary was happening in the cafeteria. But instead of the entertainment they'd expected, they found themselves witnessing a revelation that challenged everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the people they'd dismissed as invisible. Kevin Walsh, who'd relied on his father's position for protection throughout his school career, began to understand that family connections meant nothing to someone who'd faced actual danger. Rather than high school politics, his mother's title as assistant principal seemed laughably insignificant compared to the credentials being presented by the woman he'd helped humiliate. "During my second deployment," Maria said, her eyes scanning the faces around her with the analytical precision she'd once used to identify threats in hostile territory, "I was responsible for gathering intelligence that prevented a coordinated attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. My work directly contributed to saving the lives of over 300 American service members." Ashley Chen, whose confidence had always stemmed from her family's wealth and social position, felt a creeping shame as she realized she'd been mocking someone whose achievements dwarfed anything her construction executive father had ever accomplished. The designer handbag that had symbolized her status suddenly felt heavy and meaningless. In her trembling hands, "I've trained Iraqi and Afghan military personnel, built intelligence networks in regions where speaking to Americans could mean death for local civilians, and made tactical decisions under pressure that most of you couldn't handle in your video games," Maria continued, her voice never rising but somehow commanding absolute attention from everyone within earshot. Tyler Brennan, who'd initiated this confrontation with such confidence, now found himself face to face with the collapse of every assumption he'd made about the quiet woman who served his lunch. His father's car dealerships, his family's social connections, his own popularity and privilege, all of it seemed insignificant when measured against actual service and sacrifice. "The Purple Heart I earned," Maria said, reaching into her other pocket to retrieve a small case containing her actual medal, "came from shrapnel wounds I sustained while providing covering fire for a medical evacuation under enemy assault. I stayed conscious long enough to coordinate our defensive positions and ensure that wounded soldiers reached safety before I allowed myself to be treated." She opened the case and held up the medal, its purple ribbon and gold profile instantly recognizable to anyone who'd learned American history. Several students gasped audibly, finally understanding that they'd been tormenting a genuine war hero while she served them lunch with patience and professionalism. "After my military service," Maria continued, "I could have taken any number of positions that paid more money and commanded more respect. I chose to work here because I believe in service, in contributing to my community, and in treating every job with the same dedication I brought to defending this country." The silence in the cafeteria was now complete, broken only by the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sounds of classes continuing in other parts of the building. Students who'd been laughing and recording moments earlier now stared at their phones with something approaching horror, realizing they'd documented their own cruelty toward someone who deserved their deepest respect. Madison Wells began crying quietly, her homecoming sash feeling like a weight around her shoulders as she contemplated the gulf between her manufactured achievements and the real accomplishments of the woman she'd tormented. Her beauty pageant victories and student government positions seemed hollow and meaningless compared to actual service in actual combat zones. "Every morning," Maria said, her voice dropping back to conversational volume, but losing none of its impact, "I wake up grateful to live in a country where teenagers can attend school without fear of suicide bombers, where young people can pursue their dreams without worrying about religious extremists or ethnic cleansing or the kind of violence that destroys entire societies." She looked directly at Tyler, her gaze steady and unblinking. "I serve to protect your freedoms, your safety, your right to get an education and build whatever kind of life you choose. I never expected gratitude, but I certainly didn't expect to be treated like garbage by the very people I spent decades protecting." The transformation was complete. The quiet, seemingly powerless lunch lady had revealed herself as a decorated combat veteran, whose courage and sacrifice had literally helped preserve the peaceful society these students took for granted. The immediate aftermath of Maria's revelation rippled through Jefferson High School like a shockwave, spreading beyond the cafeteria walls with the viral intensity that only teenage social networks could achieve. Within minutes, the videos that students had intended as entertainment became evidence of their own moral failure, shared not with pride, but with growing horror as the reality of their actions became undeniable. Emma Rodriguez, a sophomore who'd witnessed the confrontation while eating lunch at a nearby table, was the first to break the stunned silence. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor, and began to applaud. The sound echoed strangely in the vast space, a solitary acknowledgement of respect that seemed to awaken others from their shocked paralysis. One by one, other students joined her. First Sarah Kim, a quiet junior who'd always felt invisible in the school's social hierarchy. Then Marcus Thompson, a freshman who'd been bullied himself and recognized the courage it took to stand up against systematic cruelty. The applause spread like wildfire, growing from a handful of students to dozens. Then to nearly everyone present, Tyler Brennan stood frozen in the center of this unexpected tribute, his face cycling through emotions he'd never experienced before. The easy confidence that had defined his high school career crumbled as he realized that the person he'd been tormenting was everything he'd pretended to be but never actually was. His athletic achievements, his family's wealth, his social popularity, all of it felt fraudulent when measured against actual heroism and genuine service. Jake Morrison, whose identity had been built around physical prowess and masculine intimidation, found himself trembling as he contemplated what Maria could do to him if she chose to respond to his harassment with the skills she'd learned in combat zones. But even more unsettling was the realization that she'd chosen restraint and professionalism when she could have easily humiliated or even physically dominated him. Madison Wells had stopped crying and now stared at Maria with something approaching awe. Her entire worldview, built on superficial achievements and social manipulation, had been shattered by the revelation that true strength came from service and sacrifice rather than popularity and privilege. The homecoming crown she'd been so proud of now felt like a child's toy compared to military decorations, earned through actual courage. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her office, drawn by the unusual commotion in the cafeteria. She'd been reviewing budget reports when the noise level suddenly shifted from the typical chaos of teenage conversation to something more focused and intense. What she found was Maria Santos standing at the center of a crowd of applauding students, her military identification and Purple Heart visible in her hands. The cafeteria supervisor's face went pale as she processed the scene before her. She'd known that Maria was a veteran, but the vague mention of military service during the hiring process hadn't prepared her for the reality of employing a decorated combat hero. Her pragmatic decision to avoid confronting student harassment now seemed not just cowardly but actively shameful. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been conducting a routine observation in a nearby classroom when a student burst in with breathless reports of something extraordinary happening in the cafeteria. Her initial irritation at the interruption transformed into concern as she recognized the potential for a serious incident involving one of her staff members. She arrived at the cafeteria to find Maria surrounded by respectful students, her story spreading through the crowd like gospel. The assistant principal's progressive education philosophy had always emphasized restorative justice and positive reinforcement, but she'd never considered how those principles applied to protecting staff members from student abuse. Watching Maria command the respect of students who'd been tormenting her just minutes earlier, Dr. Walsh realized that her hands-off approach had enabled systematic cruelty toward someone who deserved the school's highest honor. Word of the confrontation reached the main office within 15 minutes, carried by students who understood they'd witnessed something that transcended typical high school drama. Principal Robert Martinez was in a budget meeting with district administrators when his secretary knocked urgently on the conference room door. The whispered message she delivered made him excuse himself immediately and head for the cafeteria. Martinez arrived to find a transformed environment. Students who normally rushed through lunch to maximize their social time were lingering at tables, engaging in animated discussions about military service, sacrifice, and respect. The usual background noise of teenage superficiality had been replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. Conversations about purpose and valor that these privileged suburbanites had never needed to consider. The videos that students had recorded underwent a dramatic recontextualization as they spread across social media platforms. What had been intended as cruel entertainment became powerful testimony to the dignity and restraint of a woman who'd endured systematic harassment, while possessing the skills and background to respond far more forcefully. Comment sections filled with shame, apologies, and expressions of respect from viewers who recognized the profound moral failure the footage documented. Kevin Walsh found his father in her office, frantically fielding phone calls from parents who'd seen the videos and demanded explanations for how such harassment had been allowed to continue unchecked. Dr. Walsh's carefully maintained reputation as a progressive educator crumbled as the community realized that her policies had failed to protect a veteran from the very students those policies were designed to nurture. Local news outlets picked up the story by evening, alerted by social media posts that had gone viral throughout the county. Reporter Jennifer Chang from Channel 7 News arrived at the school as dismissal began, hoping to interview students and staff about the incident. What she found was a community grappling with uncomfortable questions about privilege, respect, and the invisible heroes working in their midst. The story that aired on the evening news featured interviews with students who'd witnessed Maria's revelation, their faces reflecting genuine remorse and newfound understanding. Emma Rodriguez, who'd been first to applaud, told the reporter, "We had no idea who she was or what she'd done for our country. We just saw a lunch lady and thought that meant she didn't matter. We were so wrong." Social media exploded with support for Maria and condemnation for the students and administrators who'd allowed the harassment to continue. Veterans organizations across the state shared the story, expressing outrage that a decorated service member had been subjected to such treatment while working to serve her community in a different capacity. The hashtag Respect Our Veterans began trending locally, accompanied by photos and stories of other veterans working in civilian jobs who deserved recognition rather than ridicule. The incident had sparked a broader conversation about how society treats those who'd served, particularly those who'd transitioned to humble civilian roles after distinguished military careers. Tyler's father received dozens of angry phone calls at his car dealerships, customers threatening to take their business elsewhere unless he addressed his son's behavior. Madison's mother faced similar pressure from the community organizations she'd worked so hard to impress. Jake's college recruiters began reconsidering their interest after video evidence of his character became public knowledge. By midnight, the story had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms, each repost adding new layers of commentary about respect, service, and the dangerous assumptions people make about others based on their current circumstances rather than their history and character. The quiet lunch lady, who'd endured months of systematic abuse, had revealed herself as a warrior whose service and sacrifice dwarfed anything her tormentors had ever accomplished, transforming not just her own situation but the entire school's understanding of heroism and respect. The following Monday morning arrived with an atmosphere unlike anything Jefferson High School had experienced in its 23-year history. Students who normally burst through the entrance doors with casual indifference moved with subdued respect, their weekend having been spent processing the viral videos and news coverage that had made their school the center of a national conversation about dignity, service, And the treatment of veterans. Maria Santos arrived at her usual time of 5:15, unlocking the cafeteria doors with the same keys that had jingled against her belt for 8 months. But everything else had changed, in ways both visible and profound. Taped to the serving counter was a handwritten sign that read, "Thank you for your service. Master Sergeant Santos," decorated with small American flags and signed by dozens of students who'd arrived early specifically to show their respect. Transformation began immediately during breakfast service. Students who'd previously mumbled their orders or ignored her entirely now made eye contact, smiled genuinely, and thanked her not just for the food but explicitly for her military service. Several wore small flag pins on their backpacks or clothing, gestures that might have seemed superficial but represented a fundamental shift in their understanding of the woman serving their meals. Tyler Brennan had spent the weekend in a state of emotional turmoil unlike anything he'd experienced in his privileged 17 years. His father, Michael Brennan, had delivered a lecture about respect and consequences that stripped away every excuse and justification Tyler had constructed for his behavior. The car dealership owner, himself a veteran of the Gulf War, had been mortified to learn that his son had been systematically abusing a decorated combat veteran. When Tyler appeared at Maria's station during the first lunch period, his usual swagger was completely absent. His hands shook slightly as he approached, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the arrogant confidence that had characterized his previous interactions. "Master Sergeant Santos," he said, using her proper rank for the first time, "I need to apologize to you. Not just for last week, but for everything I've done since you started working here." Maria studied his face carefully, recognizing the genuine remorse that replaced his former cruelty. Her military experience had taught her to distinguish between sincere repentance and manipulative performance, and what she saw in Tyler's eyes was authentic shame mixed with newfound respect. "Go on," she said simply, neither encouraging nor dismissing his attempt at reconciliation. "I was wrong about everything," Tyler continued, his voice growing stronger as he found the courage to continue. "I thought because you worked in the cafeteria, you weren't important. I thought I was better than you because of my family's money and my popularity at school. I realize now that you're everything I pretended to be, but never actually was. You're brave, you're strong, and you've done things that actually matter." The apology took several minutes, during which other students gathered to listen rather than simply collect their food and leave. Tyler acknowledged specific incidents of harassment, accepted full responsibility for his actions, and made no excuses based on his age or ignorance. When he finished, Maria nodded once and said, "Apology accepted. Mr. Brennan, the question now is what you're going to do differently going forward." Madison Wells had undergone her own weekend of reckoning, guided by parents who'd been horrified to see their daughter's cruelty displayed for the entire community. Her mother, despite her own social climbing tendencies, had been raised by a father who'd served in Vietnam and understood the sacrifice that military service represented. The conversation they'd had about respect, privilege, and genuine accomplishment had shattered Madison's carefully constructed self-image. Her apology was more emotional than Tyler's, accompanied by tears that seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "I'm so ashamed of how I treated you," she said, her voice breaking with the weight of her remorse. "I thought popularity and money made me important, but you've done things that actually saved lives and protected people. I want to learn how to be better, how to be more like you." Jake Morrison's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of the three primary antagonists. His identity as a physical intimidator had been completely undermined by the revelation that the woman he'd been bullying possessed combat skills that made his athletic prowess seem childish by comparison. His weekend had been spent researching military service, reading about the wars Maria had fought in, and beginning to understand the reality of courage versus the performance of toughness. "I've been a coward," he said when his turn came to apologize. "I thought being big and strong made me tough, but you've faced real danger and saved real lives. I don't know how to make up for what I did, but I want to try. I want to earn your respect the way you've earned mine." The ripple effects extended far beyond the three primary bullies. Kevin Walsh had been removed from student government, pending a review of his conduct, his father's position providing no protection once the community understood what had been allowed to happen. Ashley Chun had withdrawn from homecoming court, recognizing that she'd forfeited any claim to represent the school's values through her participation in the harassment. Mrs. Patterson had submitted her resignation, effective at the end of the school year, acknowledging that her failure to protect Maria represented a fundamental breach of her supervisory responsibilities. Her replacement would be someone specifically chosen for their commitment to treating all staff members with dignity and respect, regardless of their position in the school's hierarchy. Dr. Jennifer Walsh faced a more complex reckoning. The school board had initiated a formal review of her administrative practices, particularly her hands-off approach to student discipline and her failure to recognize and address systematic harassment. Her progressive education philosophy was being questioned, not for its theoretical merits, but for its practical failure to protect vulnerable staff members. Principal Martinez had instituted immediate policy changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. New protocols required administrative investigation of any reported staff harassment, mandatory respect training for all students, and regular check-ins with cafeteria and custodial workers to ensure their treatment met professional standards. Most significant change, however, was in the students themselves. Maria's revelation had sparked conversations about service, sacrifice, and the invisible heroes working in every community. Students began researching the backgrounds of other staff members, discovering that the quiet custodian was a former firefighter who'd responded to the September 11th attacks, that the bus driver had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and that the school nurse had worked in disaster relief operations across 3 continents. These discoveries led to the creation of a new school tradition, Veterans Appreciation Week, during which students would research and present the stories of staff members and community members who'd served in various capacities. The program would ensure that future students understood the honor inherent in service rather than making assumptions based on current job titles. Maria's lunch line became a destination rather than just a necessity. Students waited longer to be served by her specifically, engaging in conversations about her experiences and expressing genuine interest in her perspectives on leadership, courage, and perseverance. She found herself becoming an unofficial mentor to young people who'd never had access to someone with her unique combination of military experience and approachable personality. The national attention brought unexpected opportunities as well. Veterans organizations invited Maria to speak at events, sharing her story as an example of successful military to civilian transition and the importance of treating all veterans with respect, regardless of their post-service careers. Schools across the country implemented similar appreciation programs, using Maria's experience as a catalyst for broader conversations about dignity and respect. 3 months after her revelation, Maria stood in the same cafeteria where she'd been systematically humiliated, now surrounded by students who competed for opportunities to help with setup and cleanup. The quiet lunch lady had become a respected mentor whose military service was honored rather than invisible, whose wisdom was sought rather than dismissed. The transformation was complete, not just for Maria but for an entire school community that had learned the difference between superficial success and genuine heroism, between inherited privilege and earned respect. 6 months later, Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at Jefferson High School's first annual Veterans Recognition ceremony. Tyler Brennan, now student body president, had organized the event as part of his mission to transform the school's culture. Madison Wells had started a scholarship fund for children of military families, while Jake Morrison volunteered at the local VA hospital every weekend. When I took this job, Maria told the audience of students, parents, and community members, I thought I was just serving lunch. But you taught me that every act of service matters, whether it's in a combat zone or a school cafeteria. You showed me that respect isn't about rank or medals, it's about recognizing the dignity in every person we meet. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. In the front row sat Mrs. Chun, the new cafeteria supervisor who'd implemented policies, ensuring all staff were treated with dignity. Principal Martinez announced that the school's new motto would be service above self. Inspired by Maria's example. As students filed out, many stopped to thank Maria personally. Emma Rodriguez, now president of the newly formed Student Veteran Support Club, handed her a leather-bound book filled with letters from students across the country who'd heard her story and been inspired to treat others with greater respect. That evening, Maria returned to her small apartment, but she wasn't alone anymore. She'd found her purpose again, not just in serving food, but in serving as a bridge between the military and civilian worlds, teaching young people that heroism comes in many forms and that everyone deserves dignity regardless of their job title. What an incredible transformation. From bullied lunch lady to respected mentor, Maria's story proves that we should never judge someone by their current circumstances. If this story inspires you to treat others with more respect and recognize the hidden heroes around us, smash that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories of courage, redemption, and the power of standing up for what's right. What's your most inspiring story of someone who surprised you? Share it in the comments below.